Video tutorial today on structure charts. So as a system modeling tool, structure charts are pretty unique. Their intention is to give an overview of the system, but we don't really care about people or places or who puts the data in and where the data goes. It's a bit more granular than that. And what I mean by that is we're really caring about the actual structure of the code itself. How the modules are related to the subroutines. It's probably the most technical of all of the system modeling diagrams. We're not talking about the system in terms of the people. We're really talking about the structure of the program itself. The modules, the subroutines, and how they're all related together. What a structure chart also cares about is what variables get passed around the program. Is there like a global variable like username that might be used and passed through to all the subroutines? Is there a decision that happens at any point whether a subroutine runs or doesn't run based on something further up the chain? Does something get repeated in the system? It's the only diagram that really cares about the actual structure of the program. They look a bit scary, but they're pretty straightforward. Let me show you an example. So in the course specs, it notes a school library system. You read a structure chart from left to right. What's listed here in the boxes are all the modules and the subroutines, okay? So the whole thing at the top, kind of like what you'd put the whole system as in the circle in the context diagram, you give it a name. Now, when I'm reading this structure chart, what this says to me is the hierarchy of the system. In the school library system, there's almost two modules or two sections, a borrowing section and a returning section. We start to talk about these like parent and children. These are both the parent modules, yeah? From them, all these little subroutines happen, okay? You read it from left to right. So in the borrowing module, there is some subroutines underneath it. Just ignore all these symbols for the moment. If you can read the hierarchy, that's the most important thing. You'll notice stemming off borrowing is validate student information. On the next tier down is book information and update book and student files. The reason that the ordering is so important is this tells us that the borrowing module has a validates student information that must run first at a higher level, and then once it runs, either book information or update book and student files can run. That is why they're on two different levels. Though they both stem out of borrowing, this tells me that there is obviously a validate process that needs to happen first. When I look over to returning, underneath returning, there is three things all on the same level. I read from left to right: checkbook, update files, and reports. Okay, checkbook comes first. This weird rectangle, diamondy shape here, we'll come back to shapes in a minute, but remember that on reports. Underneath checkbook, there is a locate book record and a check if overdue. Again, the main thing that you need to get is that the hierarchy of all of these things indicates their importance within the system. This child belongs to that parent, which belongs to that parent, which all belongs to the school library system. Now, if we start to look at the symbols, if there is this weird triangle, you can either draw it between two lines if there's a choice between two different subroutines, or you can draw it like they drew it over this line here down to reports, if for some reason that one subroutine is optional. So let's go and have a look at that symbol first. Underneath borrowing, once I've validated student information, I've got that there. That tells me that I have a choice to look at the book information or a choice to update the book and student files. There's a choice between running either of those things. Okay, on the returning one, I have to do check book and then update files, but I have a choice. Now, choice is related to reports. Without having a worded scenario for this, what that tells me is that then the users might have a choice whether or not to run reports. They don't have to run the report subroutine. The next little symbol here is a repetition. It is the little arrow. If I go and find it, it's on here. This tells me in the borrowing section, once I've validated student information, I keep on repeating the choice between book information and updating the files until there's no more books. Again, with no worded scenario, I can make the assumption that the library borrowing system would allow users to borrow more than one book. Hence, once I validated their library card, they might need to update records for multiple books because that user might be lending out 5-6 books. It also tells me next to it until there's no more books. They're the hardest things. When I start to draw it, I draw the hierarchy first, then I draw the decisions and the repetitions. What these little crazy arrow looking things that are going everywhere are about is if a piece of information needs to pass from a child to a parent. So the validating student information, and I suppose like the checks and balances with this kind of stuff, you would have done a little bit out of coming out of data stores in data flow diagrams, particularly in a logon system where I check. It's when a piece of information needs to be passed from one subroutine either to a child or a parent. So if I look here, in the validating student information, if they do have valid information, that will come out. But their student ID also needs to be passed from the validating student information thing because it actually needs to be used. You'll see student ID. It needs to be used in updating the book files. Okay. In the returning thing down here, if you go to check book and locate book record, the book details comes out because book details is going to come out to check book, back to returning, and down to update files. It's also going to go down and go to reports. That piece of data can't just stay in locate book record because A, B, and C, 1, 2, and 3, whatever, I just gave them random names, they also need to use it. So it's really important that you think about when you're doing this section, is there any variables that need to go from one to the other? When you're doing that, it's then super easy to work out if you color it in or not. And here it is. If it's a Boolean, color it in. Look at the colored in ones. Valid student information, either valid or invalid, Boolean. Book available, either valid or invalid, or yes or no, Boolean. Overdue flag, yes or no. Overdue flag goes in here, yes or no. The colored in one is a flag or a control variable. It is always a yes or a no. Okay, and that's it, guys. That is structure charts. We are going to look at an example of structure charts in next lesson.